podcast, where God is most glorified by his love and provision for all people. Welcome your host, the Director of Apologetics for Texas Baptists, an adjunct professor of theology, and a local teaching pastor, Dr. Leighton Flowers.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Sociology 101. As you can see on the screen, I have a guest with me today, Riley Bounds. Riley is a supporter of the podcast and a longtime listener, and I appreciate him. And he finally was able to schedule a time where we could meet this new year. Happy New Year to you, Riley.
Happy New Year to you too.
Tell me a little bit about yourself, brother.
Well, I might have been saved back when I was about 5. I don't really know. But I kind of fell away back in high school, and I'd say that I got really serious about Christianity when I was, I think I was about 19. Do you remember in Oklahoma the May 20th, 2013 tornado?
I do, yeah.
Yeah. So I was up to see my father up at the rehab center after he had a stroke. And when I was heading up there, I didn't know that the tornado was coming down that fast, but I ran right into it and more, and I got caught in it, and I pulled into an addition, and a man flagged me down, and he took me into his house, and we barricaded the closet, and he asked me if I could pray for him, so I did, and the tornado actually went over the house, so we were unscathed. But I found out later that I think 7 kids had died at Plaza Towers Elementary.
Right.
They drowned under a wall.
Oh,
and
wow.
I thought there's no just world outside of a divine Father, where this makes any sense, that someone like me that has had my time, should make it out, and the kids didn't.
Yeah.
So I had to just kind of take that on faith, and then I got to know him more, got to love him more. So we're here today. That's where I am right now.
Oh, cool.
So
Well, it's quite a story to go through something that tragic. I know that a tornado hit Wiley back when I was in high school, and we helped to dig a lot of people out of really not only just the rubble, but just bad situations in life they're following. And there's nothing like those kinds of tragic events to kind of put things into perspective, theologically and otherwise. There's oftentimes a resurgence of people attending church and or coming to faith after horrible events, either through shootings or mass killings, or through even natural events like hurricanes and tornadoes and earthquakes and such. And so it's amazing how sometimes it's through the pain and through the heartache that God uses those times to really open up our eyes to what's really important, help us to realize our own mortality and to realize this life is relatively fragile and short. And man, there's nothing like that to really put things into perspective. Tell me a little bit about how, well, first, I guess, how did you hear about Soteriology 101? How did you come across this particular podcast, and what has drawn your interest into this?
Well, I was familiar with the work of Jerry Walls beforehand, and then I typed in on the podcast page, Jerry Walls, and it was that episode with you that was the first thing that came up. So I listened to that, and I was pretty impressed with what you said and just kind of the dialogue there. So I listened to some more episodes, and I heard you critique Sproul and MacArthur, and that's really how we got the ball rolling. So,
okay.
And then I thought, well, this is one of the only podcasts that I could find that did such good work, with countering Calvinism. So I decided to jump on.
Well, I appreciate that. Tell us a little about your own studies. Are you in school now?
Yeah, I'm actually moving to California tomorrow. So
oh, really?
I'll be going to Biola. Yeah.
Well, congratulations. That's a good school.
I'm not looking forward to the drive, man. It's gonna be so bad. But yeah, I went to a semester of SBTS up there in Kentucky, and so I got to see kind of Calvinism firsthand.
Right.
And man, you think going to a Southern Baptist seminary would actually be Southern Baptist. You don't really count on being Presbyterian. So
yeah,
I don't know. It was something else.
So but, how long is this your how many semesters have you been at did you just go one semester at Southern?
Just one at Southern.
Just one at Southern. Okay. And so it was very noticeable to you then that the seminary is Calvinistic. I mean, in other words, where the professors, blatantly Calvinistic in the way they presented the gospel and their teachings. It was
kind of uncanny how they put a lot of emphasis on you getting into systematic theology in the very first semester, but with hermeneutics, like they don't want you to approach that at all. So, I don't know if that was a conscious thing or non-conscious, but it really was like there was kind of an imbalance, and it seemed like their focus was solely so much on the systematic that they would neglect like church history and things like that just to further the idea, the system.
Right.
So it felt to me like it was kind of doing a disservice,
yeah,
to the educational needs. But
so in your own studies, you mentioned, for example, just the history or the church history in general. Have there been some things in your own studies that have led you to think that they've neglected understanding church history and maybe some of the teachings of early church fathers and others who teach differently than the Calvinist does?
And yeah, I mean, in some ways, I don't really know if they're so much neglecting church history as it just seems inconvenient. See, like I would recommend to the listeners, there's a dictionary of early Christian beliefs by David Burkott. I don't know how you say his last name, but he lists quotes on free will and predestination by people like Tatian and Justin Martyr and Irenaeus and all them, and none of them affirmed what it was that the Calvinists do today. In fact, Origen, it was Irenaeus. Irenaeus took up a long-standing debate with the Marcionites, and from what I can tell, they were mostly just like Calvinists, they're proto-Calvinists. So, it was just it was just uncanny that someone who focused so much on the church history, like they do at Southern, would just completely run over text like that, So I don't know how you can affirm it in the modern day. But
yeah, I guess if it doesn't fit the narrative of what you want students to believe and hold to, then oftentimes the focus is going to be a lot less on those things. Obviously, if you disagree with, somebody you esteem, and if an early church father like Irenaeus or Ignatius or Polycarp or Justin Martyr, John Chrysostom, and so many others teach explicitly the doctrine of libertarian freedom in the way that we would hold it, it doesn't fit the narrative of the typical Calvinist in the way that they would uphold, especially Augustine's teaching on the subject. And so I can see why those who are in the Calvinistic framework, like the professors at Southern, have to be by signing the abstract of principles. They have to affirm at least, I would say, 3 or 4 point type of Calvinism. Not a high Calvinism like a superlapsarian type of Calvinism, but they definitely have to affirm the basic premise of what we would consider Calvinism.
I think you'd be kind of surprised at how many superlapsarians there are at Southern, though.
Really? Is
Yeah,
that
it's by
obvious?
no means just stopping at emeraldism, or how do you say it?
Emeraldism, yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, it doesn't just stop there. I had uh, I wrote a paper concerning the sufficiency or insufficiency of general revelation for salvation,
Oh, really?
and yeah, I had a professor um, who critiqued me whenever I said that unless one holds to the doctrine of limited atonement, I would, you know, um, I would find I can't really remember the whole context, but
Right.
anyway, what he was upset with me about was that I was kind of comparing this determinism that Calvinists hold with the doctrine held in Islam, where
Right.
Islam says that surely Allah does not love the unbelievers. I think that's in the third surah. Anyway, and I was comparing that with the doctrine of limited atonement, because if you can't, I mean, if God has so effectually damned, 75% of the world's population before the foundation of the world arbitrarily, I don't see how there's any difference really between that and a God that does not wholly love, as he so claims. So, in that way, the professor told me that my position was lacking, ridiculed me quite a bit, and I really don't like. There's no moderate stance, it seems, anymore. It's kind of like you've been saying, that people tend to progress further and they're systematic, and it seems that Southern really wants to keep going down the rabbit trail, you know.
Yeah.
So
Well, I've always felt like there's a little bit. I talked with Eric Hankins about this on an episode not long ago about the imbalance within the convention, because the seminaries that are currently presided over as presidents that are more Calvinistic leaning, like Southern is with Al Mohler, have the requirement of signing a Calvinistic,
principles.
the Calvinistic statement of faith. But the seminaries that are presided over by non-Calvinists, like Southwestern or New Orleans, with Chuck Kelly and Paige Patterson, they don't require their professors to sign, let's say, the traditionalist statement or some other statement that is non-Calvinistic. And it seems to me that if we're going to be a convention that promotes unity and diversity and having diverse views, that we would allow our seminaries to have professors that hold to various perspectives on this subject, versus being monolithic on soteriology, as Southern would have to be based upon the requirements. And so it's one thing for the Calvinists within the Southern Baptist Convention to say, we want unity here, we all want to just get along. It's a whole other thing for them to actually put their money where their mouth is, so to speak, or actually live that out practically and say, you know what, we're going to model that by removing the professor's requirement to adhere to a Calvinistic document in order to teach here, in hopes that we can have more of a balanced approach from our seminary and our teachers that are going to teach and present what has happened historically, not only first century kind of history, but also the history of the Southern Baptist. Yes, many of the Southern Baptist or founders were Calvinistic leaning, but it's really funny if you go back and you look at the history of the SBC and you look at the growth of the SBC, and you've got a few hundred people coming to the SBC conventions back in the time when Calvinists were running it. I mean, it's a very, very nominal number of people. It's a very small convention. And it's only later, after we move away from our Calvinism and become very evangelistic in our focus, that you begin to see the thousands upon thousands of people begin to show up at the conventions, and the growth begins to take place. If you just go back and look at the annual meetings and the numbers of attendance, you can see that it's proportional. It's like as Calvinism dies out and goes away, and more of a traditional perspective of the Herschel Hobbes, of the past rise in vogue, so to speak, in popularity among the seminaries and the teachers and the pastors, that SBC becomes known as the largest Protestant denomination in the world. And so the SBC, whether Calvinists like it or not, as we know it, the largest Protestant denomination in the world, became that under the teaching of traditionalism, not Calvinism. Right. And so when we say traditional Southern Baptist, we're not trying to negate the fact that there have been streams of both Calvinist and non-Calvinist in the Southern Baptist from its roots. What we're saying is that the convention as a whole and the mass of the convention in its growth and in its heyday has been predominantly traditionalistic soteriologically. And that's the point. And I think the point you were making earlier, that, hey, if I go to Southern, I'm expecting to get a Southern Baptist education, which is the mark of what true Southern Baptists look like I've been, we've been used to growing up, and all of a sudden you go there and you get virtually Presbyterian doctrine, soteriologically speaking. Yeah. And that seems to be almost a bait and switch, especially when you have 80% of the people in the pews who are helping to pay for the tuition costs and subsidizing seminary educations for so many people like yourself. That just does not seem reflective of what what true Southern Baptists have been and are even today. Yes, there are some very good Calvinistic leaders in Southern Baptist circles and people who have done some great things among Southern Baptists who are Calvinistic leaning. That's great, and we're not trying to take away from that. But at the same time, my problem is, as a professor myself, is I want to see representation of all the different perspectives in such a way that allows for someone like you to be represented properly, the historical views of these soteriological systems as well as the theological perspectives rightly. Because as much effort as I try to do to play Calvinists for themselves, and I say in all my seminars when I start off, and I published in my book, hey, you should learn Calvinism from a Calvinist. It's only fair for you to learn from the original sources, recognize there are different kinds of Calvinists, different heights of Calvinism, but it's also only fair to learn traditionalism from a traditionalist. And very few Calvinists, in my experience, have taken the time to play us for ourselves, to read our works in contrast to the Calvinistic works, to give us proper airtime and explanation. Usually, not always, but usually in my experience, the Calvinists have presented the non-Calvinist position as the classical Arminian foresight, faith, look down the quarters of time kind of perspective, and don't give us really a fair hearing with regard to what we really believe. And I don't think that does justice to a good, what I would call a good education. Even in my soteriology classes with Trinity, we require them to read Grudem. We require them to read Piper. We require them to read some of the Calvinistic scholars, because we're not trying to brainwash people into just being people who just follow everything we believe. We're actually trying to educate them on the perspectives, and we believe, with free will, a young man can discern what is right based upon what he reads within the Scripture, and he sees these things in front of him. We think that he should be granted the freedom to make those choices with a good education. Right. So, I think it's unfortunate that you've had that experience at Southern. I think you'll get a much better experience at Biola, personally.
Well, I hope so. But kind of following what you were saying, it's not just the theologians that seem to not want to engage with the traditionalist side. It's also the philosophers on the Reform side. When I was in my systematic class, our kind of central textbook was the Systematic Theology by John Frame.
Oh yeah.
And I don't want to short sell John Frame. He's very smart man, very sharp. I appreciate his work. But his theological system, kind of like you talked about with Eric Hernandez, has been accused of being question begging.
Right.
And kind of like I was discussing with you earlier, William Lane Craig and many other philosophers like him, like Moreland, have addressed this. They've mentioned that this was actually addressed back in the medieval times by differentiating between the necessitas consequentiae, which is necessity of the consequences or the inference, between the necessitas consequentis, which is I can't talk, necessity of the consequent.
Right.
And it seems to me that the Reformed philosophers really just kind of want to skip over that because it seems inconvenient. I've never heard Frame address it. I've never heard Grudem address it. I've never heard White address it. And in fact, I've just kind of heard them laugh it off.
Yeah.
And aside from being just condescending and very, very disrespectful to people like William Lane Craig, I mean, it's just not an argument.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it just, I really don't find the Reform position compelling when it comes to philosophy. So.
Right. Well, and it's interesting. It really is
it.
interesting. And Jerry Walls, as you mentioned him earlier, pointed that out in my discussion with him, as you probably recall, is that overwhelmingly the theistic philosophers out there side with the more traditionalist libertarian freedom of the will perspective than those who side with the compatibilistic determinism of men like John Piper and other Calvinists. And so a lot of times it seems as if from those who are looking at the popular pastors like the David Platts and Matt Chandlers of the world and Pipers of the world, MacArthur's of the world, Sproul's of the world, they see that kind of that popular group right now of authors, pastors, and it gives them the impression that the scholastic world is overwhelmingly siding with Calvinism. But that's just not the case, especially in the philosophical world. The philosophical world is overwhelmingly siding with our perspective. And it's interesting, even in the theological world, if you're not just looking at the most popular guys right now in that little framework, then there's a lot more popularity from those that hold to our perspective as well. They're just not in that popular mainstream category at the moment. Now, I think pendulum will shift eventually. I think people will begin, like yourself, questioning these kinds of things and just beginning to ask the question, okay, who's actually answering these hard questions? And you're right. That's been my experience too, is that when the intelligent scholars like a William Lane Craig's of the world provide sound, robust answers to the problems that Calvinists bring against libertarian freedom, and the concepts of omniscience, God's omniscience, and all the things that are entailed with that. When they do that, I very rarely hear a cogent response or a respectful response, as you've said. Now, it's better in the journals, obviously, because they can't get away with what you see guys like James White do on his broadcast, where he kind of mockingly laughs it off. The scholars, in the journals begin to answer some of these things, but I don't know if you've read something that I haven't read, but it always seems to me that even in the scholarly journals that are replying to some of the arguments made by William Lane Craig and others that hold this perspective, lack of a better word, dance around the point of contention. In other words, it always seems as if it's kind of the red herring argument, or it always seems as if they say, well, that doesn't answer the question because of, and then they bring other issues unrelated to the matter. And I'd have to get the articles and pull them up, in which we may do another broadcast when I have it ready in front of me. But it always seems to me that they're not answering the actual point of contention to me. And that's why you'll hear me say the point of contention a lot. That's kind of a phrase that I use quite often, because I'm trying to highlight the point, the here's the point of contention, because it's so easy for the rabbit trails. It's so easy to distract off of the things that aren't really our point of contention. James White did it in the debate with me, and he's done it in other debates, where he refocuses from the point of contention that you're trying to narrowly hit on onto some other issue that may, yes, be an issue worthy of discussion, but it doesn't really have to do with that actual point of contention. And when it comes to the point of contention with regard to omniscience, for example, or libertarian freedom of the will, the concepts that are in focus, it just seems to me that the responses have been less than satisfactory. And of course, we would say that. I mean, obviously, we don't agree with their findings, but especially among the popular group, I don't see Piper answering the hardest of those hard questions and really dealing with them. On his Ask the Pastor John podcast, he doesn't, and maybe that's more of a surface kind of podcast to answer mainstream questions, not the deeper scholarly ones. But nevertheless, I am like you. I would love to see the scholars actually engage with that from the Calvinistic perspective, because sometimes they almost act as if we haven't. None of our scholars have presented those answers. Like, you guys just haven't ever presented any arguments. And I goes, no, that just reveals that your lack of education on the subject. I'm not trying to be mean, but it just reveals you have not read the scholars from our perspective.
Right. I mean, and that's kind of what I wanted to ask you, since you've been in the Southern Baptist world much longer than I have. Why do you see this flocking of people my age coming back to Calvinism? Is now this conflation of, I want to be more conservative, or is it just that they really do adhere to the doctrine? Because Southern is the biggest seminary in the world, from what I understand, population-wise. So, what's your take on this young, restless, Reformed movement?
I think there's several factors, Riley. I've talked about some of them before on other broadcast. For me, and I think this probably relates to some that are younger as well. But when I was 18, 19, going into college, I was coming out of kind of an environment where the church was fairly silent about these particular issues. And in addition to that, the churches tended to be more practical versus theological. And I think there should be a balance between practice and study and theology. And I think probably my generation when I was younger, had a lot more focus on big activities, big events, evangelism focused, seeker sensitive, kind of what you heard from the Rick Warrens and the Bill Hybels of the world. Not bad men at all. Very, very good guys, probably even theologically sound in a lot of ways, but their focus wasn't really on teaching theology. Their focus was on reaching lost and attracting those who don't have the gospel to Christ. And so that world tended to be a lot more like a mile wide, inch deep, so to speak, even though they're not necessarily, the leaders of that world aren't necessarily an inch deep. That's not what I'm saying. It's just that systematic that way of thinking could lead to organizations and groups that became very wide but not very deep. And you could even argue that about the Southern Baptist Convention in general, that its growth in numbers was a model of one that became wide but not real deep theologically. And that's why the pendulum seems to be like, okay, well, if you're deep, then you're a Calvinist. And if you're not deep, then you're the practitioner Arminian / theology doesn't matter much at all. And it's almost like the pendulum swinging from the one side of just the seeker-sensitive, maybe namby-pamby, even maybe lumping in with that, the prosperity gospel kinds of surface-level stuff, all in that same group. And the pendulum swinging away from that, and you find men like John Piper or Matt Chandler or Mark Driscoll before that, guys who are, they're coming down hard on sin. They're coming down hard on teaching the wrath of God and the need for justification and a clear, concise gospel, getting on to men for not being real men. And a lot of that is being taught alongside Calvinism. And it's interesting to me. I mean, I live here in Dallas, where the Village Church is one of the largest churches that is unapologetically Calvinistic. But I have several friends that attend there, and they're shocked and surprised to find out that Matt's a Calvinist. They had no idea. I mean, it's just like, what? I don't even know. They have no clue about that particular point of theology, because Matt doesn't make a huge deal of it. It's kind of like Tim Keller. I mean, you don't really hear Calvinism in his preaching unless you're looking for it. And a lot of what he's teaching and preaching is things that the younger generation has been hungry to hear with regard to deep, sound theology. But along with that deep, sound theology is mixed within it something that I don't think you or I would find very deep or sound at all, and that has to do with the soteriology of John Calvin. And that's what, you have to weed that stuff out, but along with that stuff comes some really good things that have just happened to accompany it. And that's why I love like A.W. Tozer's of the world, because they were deep and they had all of those same qualities as a Piper does, but without the Calvinism. It's like Tozer in some ways is like John Piper with the Calvinism strained out of it. You know what I mean? And that's very attractive to our generation. And so that's what I think this generation really needs, is more A.W. Tozers of the world who are deep in calling people to discipleship and to growth, and a relatively conservative belief in God's word as an authoritative truth, but at the same time not throwing out true human responsibility and the responsibility that we have to the gospel. Though I know Calvinists wouldn't say they're throwing out human responsibility, but I think for all practical purposes the system itself does. And that's the problem with it. That's why I think it needs to be strained out of this kind of movement. So that I guess to answer your question, I think this generation has been searching for deep, robust theology, and it just so happens that's better found in the Calvinistic world or Calvinistic leaning world than it is in any other. And that's unfortunate. And I think we as traditionalists need to do better at providing deep, sound instruction, not just practical guidance on how to grow a church, but also deep theological teaching and training in questions like sovereignty and predestination and omniscience and all of the different philosophical aspects that you've already mentioned here that Jerry Walls does a good job of getting into, and others do a good job getting into, but that aren't very well known in the popular mainstream society right now.
Right.
And so I don't know if that answers your question completely. There's definitely other things involved. There's probably some other components involved. The fad nature of how Calvinism got hooked into and with rap culture, with Lecrae and several others that are were, I could say were, I don't know Lecrae still is, based upon some of his statements recently. I don't know that he's still Calvinistic-ish in his approach, but that culture, along with kind of the hipster culture, with the beards and smoking, drinking, and the liberty of those things, highlighting the liberty of those things, that we don't have to be, abstaining from every kind of thing, like Baptists have been known to be abstaining from everything. They're always known for what they're against. You can't dance. I mean, even today, you ask some people from outside the church what they think of Baptists, and a lot of them, well, those are the guys that think you can't dance. That for whatever reason is just stuck on Baptist. And so a lot of times Baptists are known for what they're against, and this new generation doesn't obviously like that. And so sometimes the pendulum swings back the other direction of, tattoos, a beard, long beards for whatever reason, all that kind of hipster kind of things that makes it also faddish or cool. How those two connected, I still am baffled by that. I don't know. A couple of the quote unquote right influencers got that teaching within the world, and those who are ignorant, and I'm not saying ignorant in the mean way, I'm saying ignorant as in they just simply don't know any other form of theology, they're very likely to be convinced by Calvinism, because Calvinism is, when you're ignorant of the other worldviews, Calvinism is very persuasive. When you're very informed about the other worldviews, it's not near as persuasive. And that's been an experience of mine too. If those who've been taught my perspective first, or the perspective that we hold to first, they are baffled as to how anybody can become a Calvinist. And there was, how in the world do people even believe that? That's just ridiculous. It's those who have become Calvinists first, like I was, that understand how Calvinism is attractive. We understand why it's appealing to this generation, and we also understand that those who believe it, those who hold to it, are not going to back off of it at all. They are going to press forward with it. It's not just a side issue for a Calvinist. It is the gospel, as the center of the gospel for most of them, and they will continue to drive and to push it. And because of that, and because they've been good about it being social media, about talking to this next generation in a way that they are willing to listen. I was having a conversation earlier with a guy that works here at Texas Baptist, and we were talking about Generation Next, about the next generation, and talking about reaching the next generation. And somebody was making the point that, we need more young people speaking into this. And I don't disagree. I think young people's voices need to be heard, but I don't think the younger generation's necessarily looking for people like themselves, other young people. I think, look at John Piper. He's anything but young. Tim Keller, anything but young. The voices among this movement are not young. What it needs is that these are people who are engaging with the generation where they're best engaged. In other words, they have been really good about getting into Twitter and social media and Instagram and whatever new app has just come out, even since we started this conversation. In other words, they are innovative in getting good content to the places where young people are engaging. And that's where I think a lot of the traditionalists have failed. They have failed in engaging this generation in the medium that they're used to engaging. And the Calvinists have done really good at that.
Maybe. I think part of it, I've had this kind of theory where I think part of it is political. I really do think that people my age, it's like they're looking for father figures. Kind of like you said with John Piper and Sproul and MacArthur. You're right. All the Calvinist leaders right now are older, and I think that we see a resurgence right now among people my age with kind of like libertarian conservatism, and I think that they're taking the long road back to this kind of fundamentalism. And with the Christian set, I think that they're more willing to go further than the secular set in that respect. So in that way, they find the extreme end of the pendulum with people like the MacArthurs of the world. I think that's partially why they adhere to it. Aside from the fact that they make it sound like truth, they have this deep set conviction about it. So maybe that's part of it. I don't know.
Yeah.
But it's always baffled me, because when I found out about Calvinism, I never had this transition out of it. I just never got into it.
Yeah.
When I heard of it, there was nothing appealing about it to me. It made my existence seem, perfunctory, like I was trapped by the constraints of time to, do as I will because God wills it, and then die, and then it's a coin toss whether or not I get in, because under Calvinism, he could just as well effectually damn me, and I would have no idea,
Right.
It's like Jerry Wall said, who has any idea who the elect are or not?
Right.
So there's no way to verify it. It's kind of like the Armenian position where you can fall away from your faith. Well, where is that bar?
Yeah, where's the line? Yeah.
yeah, where is the line? So, I mean, I've always held to the traditionalist standpoint. It's just I never knew that people, were out there defending that stance.
Right.
So it took me a while to come around.
Yeah. Well, in defense of those who hold to the position that would be considered more quote unquote Arminian with as far as leaving salvation, like William Lane Craig does believe, for example, that it's. I like the phraseology, the eternal security of the believing one. In other words, as long as you're believing and following Christ, you can rest assured of your security in Him. If you're no longer believing in Christ, in other words, if you've renounced Christ, then there's no basis on which for you to have security, and then therefore you can get into a debate as to whether he was rarely ever saved or not saved if he's renounced his faith, and that's a different discussion. But I like that approach to it, because when we say we believe in the eternal security of the believing ones, then what we're saying is as long as you are believing and putting your faith and trust in God now, you can have security in Him. If you're not putting your faith and trust in Christ now, then I don't want to give you a false sense of security because of something you said you did when you were 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 either. And so I always like to point that out, because some of people like William Lane Craig, I think, would appreciate, though he holds to a view where you can, technically speaking, lose your salvation in that sense. I think he doesn't mean like you accidentally step over a line and accidentally fall away without conscious knowledge because you've sinned too much and you've outsinned God's grace. And so there is a line kind of between those two views that I think is worth mentioning. But I think you're right. With regard to why that generation, your generation even has been drawn to that way of thinking. It's the negative way of putting it is dogmatism, in the sense of dogmatism is being very, very sure and dogmatic about what you believe, and you speak it very candidly and you speak it very assuredly. Like you're not waffling and saying, well, here's one possible way of looking at this, and here's another possible way of looking at this, and these are two views that have been held historically, and this is the reason some people have held this, and some that kind of approach. And it's interesting, if you haven't noticed this, Riley. I know I have. A lot of those people, the scholars who are on my side, tend to be more like that in the way they describe these things. Adam Harwood, for example, I heard him, teach on these subjects. He's very, he presents them more as like, this is an option, this is what I believe, and this is what I think is true. But then there's also this view, and I can understand why they believe this, and here's what they say, and here's some, strong scholars that believe this, and they have some valid points on this here and here and here, but I think this is probably most likely the case. They kind of present it this way. But that's not the way James White has ever presented anything. You know what I'm saying? I mean, James White's just one example, but Mark Driscoll or the popular guys, Matt Chandler, those guys, when they preach, they don't preach like, well, it could be this or it could be this. They don't preach like that. They preach, thus saith the Lord. And when you preach philosophy with thus saith the Lord, especially when you come to omniscience and those kinds of issues that are talking about the inscrutable ways in which God in His finite way deals with a finite world, and you come with thus saith the Lord, when it's an issue that is not that clear in Scripture. We don't have a book written by Jonathan Edwards or even Louis of Melina, and there are some questions about some of those matters. There's some uncertainties about some of those things, and if you treat something certain that is not certain, that's a dogmatism, and it becomes very attractive to people who are looking for firm answers. Sometimes the best answer to a theological question is, I don't know. But a lot of people don't want to say, I don't know, because that makes them sound weak, or they feel like they're inferior by saying, we don't know this because the Bible doesn't teach us this point. We got to trust Him, even though we don't know all of the answers to all these hard questions. The Deuteronomy 29:29 kind of an answer. Some apologists especially don't like giving that answer, but sometimes it's the best answer to be given. And your generation, it seems to me, is looking for people who not only know the right answer, but are sure of themselves, and maybe they're drawn to that. I think you're right there.
Right. And it is, I've always had this kind of vacillation about whether or not we should actually even practice like systematic theology. I mean, really it is kind of putting God into a box that we can understand. And I really don't understand why we need that metaphysical framework when we can just kind of operate off the Holy Spirit inspired common sense. I know that's not good church doctrine. I know it's not good for a corporate sense, but when it comes to the individual, I'm not really sure that taking a systematized approach to the thought of God is so helpful.
Right.
In that sense. Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I do. In fact, it reminds me of the conversation Eric Kemp was having with some Calvinists on a Google Hangout just recently, where he was critiquing the systematic approach to development of theology versus a more biblical theology approach. Not that systematic can't be based upon the Bible, but a biblical approach is much more dependent upon the text, wherever the text leads, versus a systematic approach sometimes is a cobbling together, if you will, or a gathering together of several different verses that seem to be pointing a particular direction. Proof texting can be predominant within that worldview if you're not careful. But yeah, systematizing doctrine can lead to, I think, great error, and we've got to be really careful of that. And plus, when you think about how well do systems work with regard to relationships in the first place? You know, try to systematize the relationship with your wife. I tell my married friends, try to systematize a relationship with your children. Some people do that, and some people try to put the relationships into kind of a system and a routine and make it just work. But how does that usually end up? It's usually not a really good situation where a person is overly systemized in a relationship where there's not a true interaction between two people interacting in time and real living relationship with real reaction and real dialogue. If you over systematize a relationship, it kills the relationship. And I think that's very true of what we see within certain systematic theologies.
Right. And doesn't it seem to you that it treats God as a more impersonal force in that sense, for him to be something kind of siphoned down to like a formula,
right?
As opposed to somebody who, like we are right now, we are sitting and talking to each other as sentient, personal beings, and that is who God is.
Right.
And though there may be that kind of mitigation of the divine sense to our finite sense. I mean, he is still personal.
Right.
He still can be known in the sense that we can know him.
Right.
And I don't think that breaking him down like a car engine is going to aid in that sense. And with systematic theology, there is kind of that propensity for dogma, like you were saying earlier. One of the texts in my systematic theology class when I was at Southern, alongside that systematic theology by John Frame, was another book called Christian Dogmatics, and it was more or less pertaining to how we should go about, in our systematic theology, disseminating that to others. And I don't think that there's room for God as a person in that when we just adhere to that system.
Well, that's where that's the importance of the incarnation when you think about it, because what does the incarnation tell us, if nothing else, is that God's personal.
God is personal.
Yeah, right. that he's personal, and that he's willing to come into our world. That's the difference between, yes, we can affirm the transcendence of God, but we also talk about the immanence of God, that he is here, he is God with us. And that's a very personal thing, that he weeps with us, that he has joy with us, that he's reactionary. And it almost seems as if anything that suggests God as being reactionary to our prayers or to our to things that happen within the world, anything that portrays God as being in relationship and reactionary in time and space seems to be deemed as heretical within that overly systemized approach. That omni everything approach, omniscience, omnibenevolence, omni. You get all these omnis onto God, and it makes him into this, again, just a force, or somebody that's so far beyond our comprehension, which we would agree he is beyond full comprehension, but we can know what he has revealed about himself to us as a person, and that is through Christ. Who is he revealed to us through Christ? He has revealed a person who would rather die than send someone to hell. He's revealed himself as a person who desires mercy over justice. He's revealed himself as a person who forgives those who are even nailing him to a cross. He reveals himself as a person who says, not only love your neighbors, but love your enemies as well. And then he demonstrates that on the cross. Those are the personal attributes that God felt necessary to demonstrate through the complete and final revelation of himself through Christ. Why wouldn't those be the highlight of any quote-unquote systematic? Any systematic that doesn't highlight the things that Christ himself highlighted about the nature of who God really is a flawed systematic at its root, because it flies in the face of obviously what God wanted to emphasize through Christ. And so, I think all of those points are so valuable for us to be reminded that when we approach these issues, we're not approaching them as just being, hey, that's God in the system, but instead as the person he is. Sounds like you got it. It's all right.
Yeah, there were several things at Southern that kind of it was kind of like a God ear perking up. I don't know, but one of them was it seems to me that there is just something about them that they fear that if God intervenes, or if God is reactionary in some way, like you were saying, then somehow they're being impious. And I've even heard people say that if something seems illogical, like fatalism, then they will just go along with it because logic belongs to God. I've heard plenty of people say that at Southern, and it really is like you are no less a Christian if something seems illogical to you.
Yeah.
And then you start to question it.
Well, and also it makes as I think Eric pointed out the other day in our hangout, it makes Calvinism unfalsifiable, because if you redefine everything to say, okay, his good is our bad and our bad is his good, his logic is not our logic and our logic is not his logic, you can pretty much say whatever you want to say about God and just put it into the category of, well, God is God and you can't understand it, and so if you can't understand it, then it doesn't matter whether you think it's logical or not, because it's God's logic, not your logic. It's God's goodness, not your goodness. Okay, so as I think C.S. Lewis aptly argues, if his black is our white and our white is his black, then we can worship we know not what. He could be an all-powerful demon for all we know, for there's no basis on which to call him good if our definition of good means nothing, and our understanding of logic means nothing. And I'm happy to hear that some Calvinists reject that line of thinking and do strive to remain logical in their approach. But there are some, as I think you've rightly mentioned, that go so far as to make statements like that, dismissing otherwise very solid logical arguments as being irrelevant because, for whatever reason, they don't apply to God, at least your definition of him.
Right. And I should mention that some Calvinists like Sproul, he was not like a presuppositionalist like most of
Right.
the people at Southern right now are. But what is so baffling to me is if he was so if people like him are so well trained in philosophy that they could spot that question begging nature of their system, then why did they even hold to that to the initial system in the first place? Because presuppositionalism is just an offspring of Calvinism. It's just Calvinism extended. So
Well, it
I
seems
just
to
don't
me
really
that
understand why they would go with the baseline in the first place if they
yeah,
know that the consequent is illogical.
right.
So,
It seems to me that presuppositionalism, it's almost like trying to justify the need for apologetics in a deterministic world. You know what I'm saying? It's like either it seems illogical or irrational, maybe even to engage with apologetic methodologies in the first place if you believe that ultimately this pre-faith regeneration is what's going to change the will of a man, irrespective of how the presentation comes, irrespective of pretty much anything. Because if you believe the ends as well as the means are ordained by God unchangeably, then you have to also believe that God has determined that that person will not only be saved, but they will hear the means by which they will be saved. And therefore, if you walk up to somebody and you just say, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. If you believe this, you'll be saved. If you don't, you won't." You can walk away. You've done your apologetics for the day. You don't need to do anything more than present the plain spoken truth and say, "Hey, I've preached Christ and him crucified. If you believe that, you'll be saved. If you don't, you won't." And walk
right,
away. There's no reason to engage in persuasion, as we see Paul doing. Matter of fact, the word persuasion is mentioned 2-3 times more than the word predestination in the original text, but yet it gets a fraction of the focus, it seems, in our world today. There is a purpose for persuasion and a purpose for prayer, praying for the lost, engaging with the lost with the message of Christ, and all that we do in apologetics that seems superfluous if this concept of effectual calling and effectual regeneration is true among the Calvinistic worldview. And it seems to me presuppositionalism is a way to rationalize apologetics in
right.
a deterministic worldview.
I mean, it's almost like a coping mechanism to the deterministic worldview, isn't it? It's just kind of a way to just live with it as we know it. But part of what bothers me about this all is it's bleeding over into our evangelism. I got into a debate with an atheist just in the past week, and he told me, "Well, why are you even talking to me? Because according to your system, I'm damned to hell anyway, from eternity past." Something to that effect, and it really resonated with me that the Calvinists and presuppositionalists have gained so much notoriety in such a position that they're able to disseminate their system to the people they're evangelizing like that, but yet the unevangelized are completely unaware of the free will movement that we're a part of, and that C.S. Lewis, and that the doctrine that C.S. Lewis held to, and that John Lennox holds to, and that Balthasar Hubmaier held to, even back during the Reformation.
Right.
And another thing about that, until I came across your article, I had no idea about Balthasar Hubmaier was.
No.
And I recently bought his book, The Complete Writings of Him.
Oh, really?
And
Huh.
right.
You tell me what you think of it. Have you read much of it yet?
Actually, yeah, I had a quote that I was going to read on free will. It's in his
please.
Apologia.
Yeah, please do.
Let's see.
I don't own that myself, and so yeah, that's a cool thing to own. I need
It's
to
on
pick that up.
Amazon. It's
Okay.
Paperback, so it's not hard to find.
Yeah.
He who denies the freedom of the human will and says it is an empty and useless title and name only and is nothing in itself, calls God a tyrant, blames him for unrighteousness, and gives evildoers much reason to persist in their sins. Indeed, he knocks down half of the Holy Bible. So,
powerful
yeah,
quote.
Right. And what I was getting at earlier was with people like Hubmaier and other Anabaptists of the Reformation. When I was at Southern, there was absolutely no mention of them. I was under the impression that all the reformers held to this soteriology that John Calvin did. When I was in my latter days in the semester, I went to the bookstore to get some books for a report, and they had a table set out for Reformation Day, and on it was all the usual suspects, Luther, Calvin, and even Zwingli, who I don't really know much about either. But not one of them was Hubmaier or anyone else of a different perspective. And it struck me that it's almost a lie by omission. It's a denial of the history of the Reformation, because it seems that they want to leave out the dirty bits.
Yeah.
The sins of our forefathers, and you can't deny it.
Yeah.
So it just seems kind of like a lie by omission, and I think that really is detrimental.
And even among the inner circle, you've got Philip Melanchthon, who was the Greek scholar there at Wittenberg, and even by Luther's own admission, the scholar among them, who actually ended up siding with us with regard to how we interpret Romans 9 from the corporate perspective, according to his writings. And much of the Lutheran scholarship followed Melanchthon, not Luther, with regard to the teachings of the freedom of the will and corporate election, which is really interesting. That's not talked about much either. So even if you were just to stick with the inner circle of the Zwinglis, Luther, Calvin, and, Melanchthon and that group, even among them, there were people who did not all hold to 5-point tulip systematic. And so to try to paint the Reformation as this monolithic group of tulip-holding Calvinists is absurd in and of itself. And then you add into that the influencers, many of who predate Luther, who did a lot of groundwork, like Balthasar Hubmaier, to get to the point of questioning the ills of Rome and the doctrines of Rome, who held to views that are very much more similar to Southern Baptists today, like Christian liberty, like the baptism of believers versus infant baptism. These are people who were burned at the stake for that belief, and millstones tied around their neck and thrown into rivers for their beliefs. And we wonder why we don't have many writings from people who held to our theology throughout history. Could it be that they were burned early in life and their writings along with them? Could that be why so many of the writings of the things we hold to are not so prevalent to us today? Because the quote unquote, and I don't say this in a mean way towards Calvinists today, but the bullies of the past tended to be more Calvinistic in their theology. And therefore, they were the ones who silenced, either by torture, killing, and or burning, both the people and the materials they produced, anything that anybody said that disagreed with them. And so how much more so is it important for us to look through Christian history and find those with the fruit of the Spirit, not only in their doctrine, but in their lives, people who weren't necessarily burning everybody and their writings, but who were being maybe a little less dogmatic in the way they presented their views, who actually presented a Christ-like attitude in their presentation of their doctrines. Those were the people who would often, I would think, get bullied. The Adam Harwood or myself lived back in those days. We certainly would have been among the first to be killed. Today, you obviously don't have the luxury. We have the luxury today to put things out on podcast immediately, and I mean that's relatively new, just within my lifetime for certain, and even since I've been in college, that we have the luxury of being able to put information out almost immediately like this to counteract other views and doctrines. But back in those days, the information was disseminated so much more slowly, and it was also snuffed out so much more quickly and easily. with especially with the use of torture and murder and other things. And so, yeah, all those are I think valuable points for us to be able to at least acknowledge and to be able to own the mistakes of our past. And I know this is going to be a touchy subject, and I'm not trying to be overly controversial in saying this, but you talk about church history too, and admitting our ills of our past and the mistakes of our past. I think it has to be recognized and noted that chattel slavery was most often defended by those who held to a more deterministic, fatalistic way of theology. Matter of fact, many of the people who held to chattel slavery and supported chattel slavery in United States were the Presbyterian and or the Calvinistic Baptists. And they would often use their theology of God creating an elite group or people who the elect as the model for why they would say that, rich white people, it was among the rich and the white that Calvinism was the most popular. The Princeton theologians and those that held to that, and many of the more upper class and predominantly affluent parts of society were more Calvinistic, and they would use philosophy related to Calvinism to support that. Now, let me just back up and just say real quickly, I'm not trying to say Calvinists today in any way support chattel slavery and would totally and completely denounce anything that has to do with that. I know that completely. And as a Calvinist, I would have been appalled at somebody trying to say that I, because of my Calvinism, would support chattel slavery. That's not at all what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is that is a blight that is associated with those who held to a particular worldview, and you can't just ignore it. Just like it's a blight that many who held to the Calvinistic worldview in the Reformation period were people who did believe that it was okay to torture and kill people. They tended to be more dogmatic and hard in their way of treating those who disagreed with them. That is just a fact of the matter, though. It's not me trying to be polemic and me trying to be mean. It's me stating a fact of the matter. And I'm also stating the fact because could it be that bad theology with regard to God's love and forgiveness and patience towards people, his enemies, could affect how you yourself apply that theology to people? Because if you believe like Balthasar Hobmeier did, that we shouldn't use sword and fire to persuade the lost, but we should use patience and prayer because that's what Jesus does for us, that he's patient with us, he's longing for us, he's died for us, he's provided for us, he wants us to be saved, and he believes that about every single person, that therefore he would be more patient and long-suffering towards every single person because he believes every single person has the opportunity to actually be convinced and saved. That right. Plays out practically in his theology. Whereas if you believe that God has pre-selected who's going to be saved and who's not, and you believe that if someone's really going to be saved, they will, and they're dogmatically fighting against you and they're dogmatically standing against you, you're less likely to be patient with them because you'll start to reason, even if wrongly so, well, that person may not be elect, that God may have already rejected that person. That person must be an enemy of God. And so, hey, let's torture them, let's kill them, let's get rid of them. Again, that's the mindset of people in the past, not obviously of people today.
Well, yeah, but it's kind of like your theology is, you know how they say like your car says a lot about you. I mean, in a way, it's like your theology says a lot about your view of God. And I really don't know how Calvinists will deal with this root in Marcionism and Gnosticism. I don't understand how they can still hold to this if the early church fathers were so vehemently against what those people taught and called them heretics. I'm not saying, Calvinism in and of itself is heretical. I think that a lot of Calvinists are heretics because they're divisive, purposefully. But I really do not see how any respectable scholar today can hold to this, knowing that history. That's part of what's galling about this is people like Piper and all of them have heard the arguments from the other side. I'm sure they've been around long enough.
Yeah.
But for some reason, they still don't find them convincing enough. I don't know if it's because they haven't been subjected to somebody as, eloquent about it as Wayne Lane Craig or Lennox.
Right.
But I mean, it's just baffling that somehow this train just keeps going and its end is growing.
Yeah. Well, I think you can get hardened into a systematic, into a way of thinking, especially if your livelihood and you become known as a part of that. And you know what I mean? It's hard to see something objectively once you've really put yourself in that worldview, so much so that it's even if you begin to see glimpses. And I remember this vividly, even when I was a Calvinist, when I started kind of having some doubts about Calvinism and kind of like the emperor has no clothes kind of doubts, like that just doesn't seem to hold water there. And I remember having those doubts, how I would bury them, literally. I mean, I remember having doubts like that and thinking to myself, well, man, really, really smart people believe this and they have answers to it. I may not know the answers to it, but they do. And I just need to study better. I just need to, you know what I mean? I just need to study more because I don't know how to answer that question, but I'm sure John Piper would know how to answer that question. I don't know how to answer that question, but I'm sure John MacArthur would know how to answer that question. So they're really, really bright and intelligent. A lot of people like and follow them. So it's a hard issue, but I'm just going to trust that answers are there that I'm just not aware of yet. And that's kind of how I would bury it. And once I begin to do a study and to really begin to examine with objectivity the answers that they were providing, I begin to realize how lacking those answers were and how really they didn't have many answers to the questions that I was struggling with myself, and that their answers oftentimes either question begged or dodged the question altogether. And once I realized, of course, about the biblical perspectives that I hold to now with regard to judicial hardening and messianic secret and all the things that we've talked about on our broadcast and other shows, then there was nothing by which to really push down that hard, difficult pill, even by their own estimation, leading Piper to cry 3 days about it. There was nothing in which to hold up that systematic once I began to see these perspectives with a different lens on. And so, yeah, I think it's just a matter of time. I really do, that the pendulum will begin to swing, and it may even already tinges of it now. I seem to feel that way maybe because of what I'm doing, and I get so many messages because of my podcast that people know me, and so I get messages telling me about how they come out of Calvinism. And so it feels like to me that resurgence is already kind of on its peak and coming back the other way. But I admit I'm not probably a very good judge of that because I'm getting messages that are uniquely, sent to me, and that's probably not a very good picture of what's happening holistically right now. I think very likely Calvinism is still on the rise in the public eye, in the public world. Relatively speaking, my audience is fraction, just a very small fraction of just John Piper's audience. It's just it's minuscule as compared to what Piper has as downloads and those kinds of things, and that's just Piper. Yeah, that's just John Piper.
You should take heart that you have half the number of subscribers that Southern Seminary does. So you are well on your way.
Oh.
But
well, I don't know. I don't know. A lot of those prescribers are likely Calvinists who are contending with what I'm saying, and so I always try to point out that just the number of prescribers is not necessarily showing the number of supporters, because I've got a good number of people who prescribe and watch and follow that are not at all agreeing with what I'm saying, and that's because Calvinists tend to be more interested in this issue than are the non-Calvinists. A lot of non-Calvinists are ignorant of this issue, generally speaking, and are perfectly content being ignorant of it. In other words, I don't even want to get involved in this. Just leave me out of this. I want to have nothing to do with it. And so,
glass half full, But
yeah, absolutely.
what I do worry with the rise of Calvinism is, especially within the ranks of the SBC. I know you have an election coming up. Now, I'm honestly non-denominational. I'm not a member of a Baptist church, but I do know that as the largest evangelical denomination, you have a lot of sway and you have a lot of overseas ministry and relief aid going on. And it may be kind of a slippery slope fallacy on my part, but I do worry that if we become a Calvinistic denomination, wholly, what will that impact us as far as our ministry goes, as far as our aid and relief efforts and things like that? If we hold to a system of determinism, what will happen, and there are only a select few that are getting in anyway.
Yeah.
That really does frighten me, that this will become the face of American Christianity in a way.
Yeah, and I understand that fear, Riley. I really do. I also believe that if people are the kind of Calvinists, as inconsistent logically it may seem to us, to be the kind of Calvinist that John Piper has been in his life, or that we see with Matt Chandler, for example. These men, David Platt, these men are very outreach focused and very evangelistic focused, and I praise God for that, and I appreciate that. What my concern is I think the same one that you're expressing, is that not every outflow or outpour of what Calvinism produces is reflective in those antidotal leaders. And the fact that they are leaders is probably reflective of the fact that they have been so outreach focused and have been so evangelistic, whereas the rank and file, for lack of a better word, of Calvinistic groups out there have been more predominantly marked by stagnant, lack of growth, small congregations. And that's not what you're seeing among the Tim Kellers of the world, obviously, or the Matt Chandlers of the world, but those are somewhat anecdotal and somewhat, small examples of what you're seeing, how it plays out within the young, restless, reformed type of individual who is becoming more and more angry, more and more supra in his lapsarian views, higher in his Calvinism, more consistent logically, and even, whether he admits it or not, more fatalistic in his ways of practical theology with regard to evangelism and outreach. That is I think a fair fear to express, is how will that play itself out? And I've mentioned the Sproul family before, just simply because you have with R.C. an infralapsarian classical apologist with R.C. Sproul Jr., despite his moral failings. That's not what I'm trying to get into, and I'm not even blaming that on any of his Calvinism. That has nothing to do with that, so don't hear that. But his theology was much more supralapsarian, a higher form of Calvinism, and much more presuppositional in his apologetic. At least it seemingly to me, based upon what I heard him say and teach when he was teaching in those formats. That's what I'm more concerned about, because historically, Calvinism has tended to become higher in its approach, more logically consistent within its systematic, and thus more stagnant and less outreach focused in future generations. And so while you have some good Calvinists who are, by our estimation, inconsistent in their practical applications, what will the next generation look like of Calvinists? And I don't know. I really don't.
There is kind of a self-awareness in a way, it seems, among the Calvinists, emerging at least. When I was at Southern, I had a New Testament course, and there was one point where the professor mentioned that among the Reformed groups, there is this tendency to be so hardline and dogmatic, and focusing so much on God's glory that they forget God's love. And he said, Christ dealt with the people like that very regularly, and they were called the Pharisees.
Yeah.
And I think that it really hit me that there was finally this kind of self-revelation, that people in the Calvinistic circles really do tend to have a lack of compassion, for anyone that doesn't hold their systematic. And maybe like maybe there will be a turnaround. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and I will say, just to soften that a little bit, that is some, and especially seen more with the internet kinds of guys you run into the Calvinism, younger. It seems to be younger kind of Calvinist, not always, but that are a harder line like that. And I will say, I've seen some pretty mean non-Calvinists out there too. And so that does cross lines, just as you said, the whole heresy issue. I've seen people with right doctrine with regard to free will acting heretical in the sense of being divisive in the way that they approach the things too. And so I know you see that too. I'm only saying that because I know there are Calvinists that listen to this, and we're not trying to say, at least I don't think we're trying to say, that just because you're a Calvinist that makes you XYZ. What we're saying, and I think that it needs to be pointed out, is that if you are Calvinistic, historically speaking, history has a tendency to repeat itself. Calvinists have become known for certain attributes throughout history and even more recently, and that has to do more with being dogmatic, speaking certainty about things that aren't necessarily presented as certainties within Scripture, treating enemies, people who disagree with them, in a more harsh way, being less cordial and less kind with people that are different than you and less like you. That historically is able to be demonstrated and able to be shown as factual. Even just little anecdotal things like you typing into Google, "Why are Calvinists so?" and then looking at the things that naturally have been searched for on Google are things like, why are Calvinists so mean? Why are Calvinists so nasty? Why are Calvinists so angry? Why are Calvinists all these negative attributes? Whereas if you do that with Arminians, it's usually, why are Arminians so stupid? Why are Arminians so dumb? Things like that, because it's the Calvinists looking up why our Arminians don't accept and agree with them. And so even little, again, that's anecdotal, but it's reflective of the culture of a system. And though there are many, I think of the guys with Doctrine and Devotion, I think of Sean Cole, and I think of a lot of Calvinists who I engage with on Google Hangouts here and there, who, Josh, known as Calvin Klein on this thing, Chris Harris and others, who virtually almost always very kind and loving towards me, though we disagree vehemently with each other. And so there's always exceptions to those quote unquote generalized statements and rules. But that's the whole point of what you're saying, is just because Matt Chandler and John Piper are kind and considerate and outreach missions minded people, will that necessarily be the outflow of the claims of their system for future generations? And if history repeats itself, the answer is no, it won't. And that should concern us, especially if it's not a true doctrine. If Calvinism is false doctrine, as we believe that it is not true, then we would be right to stand up and say, let's look at this is going to happen in our future generations. What is Southern going to produce, not only today and tomorrow, but 20 years from now? What's going to be the fruit of this teaching? And I think that's a viable question worth considering. I really do.
Right. And I hope that no one listening to this will think that I'm saying that every Calvinist is so tribal or whatever. I don't mean to say that.
No, I hear you.
I'm just kind of going off of anecdotal experience.
Sure.
So
sure.
And what I've seen. But
well, we've gone over our hour mark, which is usually typical for me, Riley, as you probably know, as being a regular listener. I always tell guys that I come on, well, let's aim for about an hour, and it always ends up going further than that because I can talk theology until the cows come home, and I'm sure you're the same way. Us theology geeks can sit around talking theology forever. But delightful conversation, brother. Thank you. If I have not said thank you enough, I know I've said thank you before, but thank you for supporting Soteriology 101. Thank you for the contributions you make in sharing the broadcast and talking about it. And those who are listening to this, thank you for continuing to make Soteriology 101 more known, so that people are at least finding out that there are other answers besides that which is being provided by the Calvinists today. And that's only going to be done by people getting behind it and making it happen. So I really do appreciate that, Riley. Any last words before we close this down?
No, just thank you and God bless.
God bless you too. Appreciate you, brother. Bye-bye.
Bye.